All right, so on that basis of the first name and the second name, we have three types of fibers throughout our body, okay? So on the basis of that first name category we talked about, and the second name, there are slow oxidative fibers, which is like one end of the spectrum. There are fast glycolytic fibers, which is the other end of the spectrum. And right in the middle, sort of intermediate, are the fast oxidative fibers, okay? So we're gonna describe each of these fiber types. Now, remember that they're not mainly found, how should I say, they're not found exclusively. So in my biceps muscle, I'm not gonna have all fast glycolytic. I'm not gonna have all slow oxidative. What I'm gonna find is a mix of fibers, but predominantly one type over the other, okay? So let's speak about slow oxidative fibers first. And again, I want you to associate slow oxidative fibers with that slow, steady, long distance runner. Okay, there is low myosin ATPase activity. So these contractions are going to be much slower, but much more sustained. Okay, we're going to have lots of oxidative capacity, which simply means more mitochondria, more myoglobin, lots of capillaries, and a smaller fiber diameter. Okay, all of those factors translates to oxygen coming in to supply oxidative phosphorylation. We're also going to have less tension being produced simply because we have a smaller diameter. Now, why does a smaller diameter translate to less tension? This ties into something we talked about last time. Why does a smaller diameter mean less tension? What do we have less of? What do we have less of? What's that main factor that determines how much force we generate? Crossbridge cycles, right? So if we have a smaller fiber diameter, that translates to less sarcomeres, right? Less myofibrils, less muscle fibers, which means less crossbridge cycles. Remember, tension production is directly proportionate to the amount of crossbridge cycles. So a smaller fiber diameter means we're going to produce less tension, and we're going to have a smaller diffusion barrier, meaning that oxygen can easily get into these muscles. And as we mentioned earlier, we're going to fatigue much slower because we don't have that lactic acid buildup. Okay, then there are fast glycolytic fibers. So this is on the completely opposite end of the spectrum. These fibers have high myosin ATPase activity. They have high glycolytic capacity, and that translates to lots of glycogen stores, lots of glycolytic enzymes, right? The enzymes that are responsible for breaking down that glucose, the whole glycolysis pathway. We need those enzymes present in a large amount to facilitate the rapid breakdown of glucose. We need lots of glycogen present in these tissues, again, to generate that ATP anaerobically. We don't have myoglobin, so again, these fibers appear white, and then they're larger in diameter. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a larger diameter translates to more force production, more tension production, simply because we have more crossbridge cycles happening, okay? And as I mentioned earlier, these are going to fatigue much more quickly because of the lactic acid buildup. The lactic acid buildup, as well as the fact that glycolysis is not as efficient an ATP source as is oxidative phosphorylation. We looked at glycolysis many moons ago in Unit 1, right? And we talked about how glycolysis generates a little bit of ATP, but much more quickly. Oxidative phosphorylation generates lots of ATP, but that takes more time, okay? Right. And then in the middle here, we have these intermediate fibers. So fast oxidative fibers are kind of a happy marriage between slow oxidative and fast glycolytic. They're sort of in the middle. They have an intermediate myosin ATPase activity. They have high oxidative capacity, meaning that they are aerobic. They require oxygen. And we know that by the term oxidative, right, their last name. They have lots of myoglobin, which also translates to oxidative, but they're slow to fatigue. Okay, they're a little bit slower to fatigue, but they're slow to fatigue, but more rapidly than slow oxidative fibers. So again, they're sort of in the middle of fast glycolytic and slow oxidative. They're going to fatigue a little bit less than fast glycolytic, but a little bit more than slow oxidative. okay? So they're right in the middle. Their diameter is, again, right in the middle, sort of intermediate. So they're gonna generate a moderate amount of force production, not as much as glycolytic fibers, fast glycolytic fibers, but not as little as our slow oxidative fibers, okay? All right, any questions on that, on the fiber types? So this is a really nice table to sort of summarize these differences. Make sure you know where myoglobin is present in high amounts, right? That's gonna be our oxidative fibers. This is why they're red, okay? Make sure you know where there's high capillary density, so lots of capillaries, again, our oxidative fibers. So a really nice study table to kind of clear this out and try to recreate it on your own. Okay, now let's move on to speak about the responsive fiber types to activity. And so basically, as I mentioned before, every muscle in our body is not exclusively one fiber or the other, but it's usually predominantly one fiber or the other. So we have a nice healthy mix of fibers, but one is usually more prominent. And we can change the energy source, the ATP source of a muscle fiber. We cannot change whether it's fast or slow. So I can condition my muscles to be more aerobic, right? I can do lots of aerobic exercises. I can train my fibers to sort of transition to more of that slow oxidative fiber, but I cannot change whether the muscle is fast or slow. So the proportion depends on the type of activities that we're doing. If you have lots of postural muscles, they're going to be more oxidative fibers, right? They're going to have to contract over a long period of time, more of a slow, steady, sustained contraction. Again, think about that long distance runner. His muscles are conditioned this way, right? That slow oxidative fiber is more prominent in those muscles. Whereas again, a heavy lifter or a sprinter has his muscles conditioned to more of that fast glycolytic fiber, okay? Now in a single motor unit, all the fibers have to be of the same type, okay? So we can't have a motor unit, and reminding ourselves of what a motor unit is, right? That single motor neuron and all of the fibers it's innervating, right? Whether it's a small motor unit or a large motor unit, all the fibers must be of the same type, okay? Either fast glycolytic, slow oxidative, or fast oxidative, okay? And we also want to remind ourselves of the recruitment, the size principle with regard to recruitment. So just like we mentioned before, we can recruit or call on additional motor units to help us lift a heavier load, to help overcome a heavier load. And we spoke about the size principle. So we're always going to recruit smaller motor units first, right? Smaller motor units with a smaller axon diameter, a smaller fiber diameter, which is attached to less fibers. And then we would call on larger motor units, okay? Now, why do you think we're calling on slow oxidative fibers first? Why are these smaller motor units? What about these fibers that we described would explain why they're attached to smaller motor units? What did we say about their diameter, the diameter of these fibers? They're smaller, right? Slow oxidative fibers have a smaller diameter, and so that explains why we recruit them first. They generate less tension, they're likely attached to a smaller motor unit with a smaller axon diameter, et cetera, okay? Whereas our fast glycolytic fibers are gonna be bigger diameter, they're gonna be harder to depolarize, and so we're gonna recruit those types of fibers last. Except if we're doing something like heavy lifting or sprinting, okay? We call on these fibers to do more strenuous types of activities. In our general day-to-day life, these are the types of fibers we typically call on: slow oxidative and fast oxidative, to really generate more force, right? Heavy lifting or again, rigorous activity, we're gonna call on fast